In this follow-up reflection on reasoning, I'm going to unpack the heterogeneity of abductive reasoning. Of the three forms of reasoning, abduction is the most heterogeneous and multifaceted. And that's why speaking of abduction at the general level is elusive and potentially misleading. We need to look at varieties of abduction and recognize which forms are used in which instance. And this is also something you need to think about as you're thinking of how you use different forms of reasoning in your own research. Here are the materials I am referencing in this follow-up reflection. I'm going to go back to my work with Supplemental, but I'm introducing also new material here. And the material I'm introducing specifically looks into the complexity and the heterogeneity of abductive reasoning. All these materials merit reading, and once again, read nothing as prescriptive. Let me first tackle the question, why do we need to make the distinction between abduction and induction? Indeed, in some circles, abduction is considered a subcategory of induction. And this makes induction synonymous with all non-deductive forms of reasoning. I think that may be misleading, and I think Peirce can help me out making sense of this and giving some justification. First of all, as we observed in the beans in the bag example in lecture number 2, is that when we engage in inductive reasoning, we generalize or we infer a rule. Whereas in abduction, we seek to explain or to interpret, to make sense. It should be obvious that generalizations and inferring rules is a different activity than explaining or interpreting. So that's why the distinction is important. Induction and abduction are forms of reasoning that are aimed at different objectives. So just from a descriptive point of view, we need to get this right. This is the most important reason that Peirce himself gave to making the distinction. He noted that from a logical point of view, and I made this point in the lecture as well, induction is a stronger kind of inference than abduction. So, if we mistakenly believe that something that is abduction is induction, we are overplaying a reasoning hand. And in scientific work, I think that if we are going to be biased in our processes of reasoning, we should be biased toward being more conservative. But as you can see, this works in just the opposite direction. We assume that something that's weaker is actually stronger. So this is, again, why the distinction is important. And Peirce offered this as the first reason why we need to make the distinction. And then there's an interesting passage in Peirce that, again, I think reflects the fact that not only was he a philosopher of science, but also an empirical scientist. He said that ultimately a lot of this is experience-based, so here is his challenge. There are many other advantages of the distinction in question, which I shall leave the reader to find out by experience. Let me give you one experience that I have had in this regard, and it has to do with the role of the researcher in the reasoning process. In my experience, as an author, as an editor, as a reviewer, portraying abduction as if it were induction misrepresents, undercuts, belittles the role of the researcher in the reasoning process. So this is why I think it's dangerous to see abduction as if it were induction. It doesn't do justice to the role of the researcher in the reasoning process. The objective of this slide is purposely to overwhelm you, So far, I have counted 36 different varieties of abduction. They can be found in the works that I have cited in this lecture. Yes, there is some overlap in these categories, but the purpose of this slide is to convince you that we really have to dig deeper into varieties of abduction if we wish to understand what is it that we do when we reason using abduction. And I think that some of these forms are more central to what we do in our field of empirical research on management and organization. Let me make 3 observations on the types and the distinctions that I think are relevant in our line of work, in our research. And these may be able to clarify some of the misconceptions. One of the central distinctions made in the literature on abductive reasoning that I think is relevant to our work on management and organizations is this distinction between creative and selective abduction. So the idea that we introduce new concepts and ideas through creative abduction versus choosing among candidate explanations or interpretations through selective abduction. So when we talked about the street corner example with the police car and the ambulance, we were really talking about selective abduction. And the idea of inference to the best explanation resonates with this idea of selective abduction. But there is also this idea that those who do work on innovation research often speak either implicitly or explicitly about creative abduction. The other distinction that I think is highly relevant is, as we're thinking of what is the conclusion of our abductions, is it an observable fact? So if we go to the street corner example again, it's easy for all of us to think about that there is something that happened in point of actual observable fact, and we could probably even find out what exactly happened. But when we think of the objectives of our research as empirical researchers on management and organizations, our abductions are not aimed at observable facts. Many of our abductions ultimately are reasoning about unobservable facts. So a lot of historical research, for instance, is trying to account for or make sense of facts that are unobservable. And often the conclusions of our abductions are theoretical notions of some kind. So they're not about observable facts. They are theoretical conclusions. So this distinction, I think, is absolutely central. What is it that we are abducing about? What is the ultimate objective? And then this third point hopefully resonates with my example of the make or buy decision. I talked about the Walker and Weber study, and I said instead of calling this hypothetico-deductive, we should really call it hypothetico-abductive. Well, if I look at the Walker and Weber study, I would say that there are many forms of abduction applied, but one of the central ones is what I might call theoretical model abduction. And as Schurz pointed out, it is extending a given theory core or paradigm to new application cases. I think that describes perfectly and descriptively accurately what Walker and Weber were doing. They were extending transaction cost economics to the case of the make or buy decision in the final assembly of automobiles. Okay, so what is the purpose of all this? So what's missing and what do we need to understand better? I'm going to conclude this by echoing some of the key conclusions from my AMR piece with Supplemental. I think that if we want to understand one another, we're sitting around a table and we are trying to understand one another's arguments and one another's reasoning, we need to be able to distinguish between the cognitive forms of reasoning and the more computational or formalized forms of reasoning. And we need to acknowledge that for transparency of reasoning to be possible, we need to understand the role of researchers as active reasoners who interpret and make sense of empirical material based on their at least partly idiosyncratic skill sets, histories, and experience. So ultimately, this is about making the subjective intersubjective. So instead of declaring that the researcher is somehow objective, and it's really some kind of an algorithm that does the reasoning for us, we must turn the subjective aspects of our reasoning into intersubjective. So whatever idiosyncratic skill sets, histories, and experience are at play, first of all, we need to acknowledge their existence and that they are part of our reasoning processes. And then for the evaluation of reasoning to be possible, what is subjective has to resonate at the intersubjective level. That, to me, is the ultimate objective here. This concludes the follow-up reflection on reasoning for session 2.